Guns+God. This is one of those Sundays where I can make all kind of enemies. I hope not. It's interesting as we begin to talk about this topic, this is not something I'm real heated up about. When it comes down, again, I'm not the center of balance, but for me personally, I grew up in a house where my dad was a hunter, mainly birds, duck, dove, quail. He was a big bird hunter. He didn't do deer or anything. But I grew up with guns around the house. I went hunting, when I was a kid with him a couple of times. It wasn't really my bag. This is interesting. I was a big water skier in high school, but I actually lettered in my high school on the rifle team. I just thought it would be fun, so I went out one day and tried out and ended up being quite the marksman. So for 2 years, I shot, and they had a rifle range down at Vanderbilt University where we would compete. So I've shot some guns in my life. Interestingly enough, however, as an adult, I've never owned a gun. Ever. I've never, even as a child, I didn't. But in my whole life, I've never owned a gun myself. I've never even had the inclination to go buy one or even want one. I enjoy shooting them. If a friend has a gun, I go out, we've shot targets and stuff. I like, seeing if I can still hit something. But for me personally, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not running around going, you better not take my guns, right? Because I don't have any. It's not a big thing for me. But I am very interested in people's lives and the loss of life. And I take that very seriously. But I've been walking this road for a long time. And I've learned that a lot of times we get all heated up and making decisions, and as the gun term would go, going off half-cocked, rather than actually knowing what in the world we're talking about. And again, I would love to tell you, for a whole week I have been studying and looking at this gun issue. In fact, I've read more articles. I don't ever want to read another article on a gun ever again, right? It's just, because there's so much debate, and people are all over the board, and you end up in a situation where, guns don't kill people, people kill people, and, other people go, gun violence is way too high in America, and everybody's got statistics. Don't you love it? Everybody, it doesn't matter what you want to prove, you can prove it with your own statistics. And everybody's got their own set of statistics of what they're... Now, here's the thing. I have pulled some stuff that I feel like was important to me. It may not be important to you, but it was important to me as a person who wants to make healthy decisions in the world and wants to have a good, godly perspective about what's going on. So this morning, I'm going to share some things that I have learned as I go down the road. And here's the big thing. Understanding ourselves is very important. Now, you know me, I love books, especially books on us, sociological studies on what makes us tick and how we think, because we are some strange, demented individuals, folks. And one of the books that I read here recently, I actually read it back when we were doing our political series, was a book called The Righteous Mind, Why People are Divided on Religion and Politics. And what was really interesting is a lot of the sociological studies that they did in this book. And what they would do is they would find hot-button issues, and they would ask people about them, and then they would present every argument opposed to their case to try to dissuade them from their position. And what they learned is that we as human beings are masters at defending our own positions, especially when we're passionate about them. In fact, when they would show direct lack of logic in these people's places, they would still argue for what they believed no matter what. And they would refute it, and they would still argue for it. And when they got down to the end, they would finally go, well, I don't care what that says. I'm just going to tell you. And, and that's our human nature. Now, interestingly enough, as they continued doing these studies, they found out that people who are more intelligent, they looked at people that had really high intelligence, are excellent at defending themselves. Even better than the average people. I mean, they are articulate, they are precise, they can clearly project their position. However, those same brilliant people that are brilliant at defending themselves, when they were asked to think objectively, were no better than the most average person on the planet. Their research comes out and shows that we are great at defending what we believe, but we are horrible at being objective. Horrible at being open-minded. We all want to think that we are, but we stink at it. It is one of our worst traits. In fact, even when forced to try to be open-minded, it's hard. They did all these studies about, how many of you all in here would like to think you're not prejudiced? Right? I don't want to be a prejudiced person. I want to be very open-minded. Well, they have these studies where they will throw up images on the screen, and it will be a person of a different race than you and a person there, and it will say which one of these is more likely to commit a crime. Which one, and one of them will have a gun in their hand and the other one won't. But you have seconds to respond, and when the thing flashes up, if it meets your perspective, you can respond within milliseconds. But if it doesn't hit your perspective, in other words, if, say for instance, the ethnic person, is carrying a shopping bag and the person of your race is carrying a gun, to see it takes almost twice as long to push the right button. And they said, even though the people realize I can't do this, when it's not in my gender, I can't do it. When it's not in my race, I can't do it as fast. And they want so desperately to do it, we just can't. There's a place where we have natural biases. And even though we want with every fiber of our being not to be biased, we can't help it. We just are. And we have to work very hard to override that bias that is in our life. Now, the last thing that they found out that was very interesting was when we talk about our ability to be open-minded and to make healthy decisions, is that when it comes down to it, we are masters at defending ourselves, even when we know it's not true. Now, and this hit me so hard, it was like getting hit in the face. He said, we are so good at it that while the author said, while I was writing this book, I had this happen, and knowing everything that I know, it still didn't stop it from happening. He goes, I was in my kitchen. I had just fixed my kids' breakfast. My boss called, and I'm on the phone with my boss, and my wife walks into the room, and I had left all of the trash from breakfast on the counter. And she walked in while I'm on the phone. I'm listening. He goes, I'm not talking, but I'm listening to what my boss is saying. My wife says to me, is it too much to ask for you to throw your trash in the trash can? He said, without missing a beat, he said, I pulled the phone down, I covered the bottom and said, I just fixed your kids' breakfast. Your son spilled his cereal. I cleaned that up. My boss called me. I'm on the phone with him. Pardon me if it's too much to ask that I don't get all of my trash in the can. Put his phone back up and continued the conversation with his boss. He goes, I couldn't help it. She made me mad. And I explained to her very clearly that she was out of bounds in what she just said. He goes, but when I cooled off a little bit, he goes, everything that I said was factual. It actually happened, but it happened over about a 20-minute period where there was ample opportunity numerous times to have picked up that trash and put it in the can. He goes, but two things happened. And he goes, I'm writing a book about this. I am so quick and so good at defending myself, I didn't even have to think about it. The moment the words came out of her mouth, I dropped that phone. I created a defense based on loose facts that had happened, put the phone back to my ear, and not only did I create an illusion that I had done that, but I felt satisfied that I had shown her that she was wrong. Anybody in here ever done anything like that? All the time. All the time. I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I go, I am good at that too. I must be, above average intelligence because I can create a story that makes me look great. And everybody else, should just, bow down and just apologize, for even asking me to do something different than I just did, right? We are that good. But when it comes to being open-minded, we're horrible. Even if we think we are, even if we want to be, it's difficult for us to be open-minded, especially about something that we're passionate about. With all that said, let's take a little look here. I wrote down my very first statement was, if we think that there are simple answers to gun control, then we are a fool. There are no simple answers to major issues like this. There are 1,000 things that need to be considered, and some of them are more important than others, no doubt, but none of them are easy. Now, as we begin to move forward, the first thing we want to do is look at James 1:9. If we think about the fact that we're horrible at being objective, James 1:9 should be a verse that we all memorize. And that verse is, "My dear friends, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God requires." Let me tell you what, we are horrible at being good listeners. Slow to speak, quick to listen, and slow to react. How many of you know that most of us are wired up 100%, 180 degrees opposite of that? Quick to speak, very slow to listen, and overreact all the time. So we're battling our own humanness anytime we enter into a situation like this. Now, the next thing is, what did Jesus say about self-defense? Because the Bible really doesn't have a lot to say about self-defense. It has a lot to say about war, and that's issue for another day. We don't have time to go into that right now. But with self-defense, it is interesting that Jesus comes down being portrayed as a pacifist most of the time, mainly because of statements like in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 38, where he says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." In other words, retaliate with the same force that was enacted on you. Seek justice to an even degree. "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you for your tunic, let him have your coat as well. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." These are powerful words. These words have changed our nation in the area of civil rights. In many, many areas, we have seen that when people met negative force with a positive respect and love, that it has changed the course of history. Gandhi did it, Jesus did it, many others have done it. These words are powerful. These are about our own personal conduct. However, Jesus also made a couple of other interesting statements that don't sound pacifist at all. One of which I'm going to read right here. In Luke 22:35, Jesus is recounting to the disciples when he sent them out for their first missionary experience. And when he sent them out, he said, "I don't want you to take anything with you. I don't want you to take a coat. I don't want you to take a bag. I don't want you to take a purse. I don't want you to take anything. I want you to walk out of this room with nothing but what you have on your person. I want you to go out into the cities and start to minister and see if I don't have people come around you to provide everything that you need." And when they came back, they said, "Sure enough." So he's recounting that. So Jesus said to them, "When I sent you out without a purse or a bag or sandals, did you lack anything?" "Nothing," they answered. But he said to them, "But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, then sell your coat and buy one." He's making this statement right before he walked to the Mount of Olives, from where he would be taken to be crucified. When he looked at them, he said, "Listen, I sent you out before to teach you a lesson. I sent you out to teach you this lesson. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to watch over you, and I'm going to take care of you." He goes, "But things are getting ready to get a little ugly out there." And he goes, "I'm encouraging now, if you have, get your purse and take it with you. And if you don't own a sword, I suggest you sell your coat and go buy one." Now, maybe they needed it to crack coconuts, okay, or harvest wheat. But because he doesn't elaborate a bunch. But in the context of what he's talking about, I am getting ready to be crucified. You're about to go out. A sword in their day was tantamount to what we would call a gun in our day. It was the primary defensive weapon that anyone would carry on them. They had spears and battle axe and all that kind of stuff. But basically a sword was the common thing that you would carry for self-defense. Now, where the boundaries on all that are, I don't really know. Jesus doesn't elaborate a lot. But that's a pretty powerful statement. Sell your coat and get yourself a sword, you know. He must have thought it was kind of important. I don't know. But at whatever need, Jesus was not completely a pacifist. He didn't ask people just to let people walk in and rape their family members, and then and not put up any resistance. That was not what he was talking about. When he was talking about not resisting an evil person, he was talking about a virtue where love can often overcome an evil situation much better than just meeting force with force. But we have a balance here. Now, as we go forward, the first thing that we run into is the Sandy Hook School and the movie theater shooting in Colorado. Create a scenario in America that shocks us. It never should have happened. Innocent lives, especially children, to be taken is something that if we are not enraged by that and motivated to do something about it, then I don't think we have the heart of God in us. That when we see innocent lives being taken in the way that they were, those 12 people in the movie theater and the 20 students and 6 teachers at Sandy Hook, if there's something we can do about that, we best be doing it. We need to be acting. But the question is, what do we need to do? What is going to make a difference? Because quite honestly, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we do that doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Feels good. It's a big emotional response. In fact, that's the next thing I want to kind of look at is I also read a book called Predictably Irrational, which is really great because it talks about how crazy we are. That we do things that don't make a whole lot of sense. That we get riled up about all the wrong things. And one of the things they talked about was the fear of flying. Anybody afraid, get a little anxious when you get on an airplane? Right? Anybody in here ever going on a plane flight and you decide to pray before you go for safety? Right? Yeah. It's irrational. In fact, last year, if you were in an airplane, you were probably in the safest place you could possibly be. In the United States, you know how many people died in airline fatalities? Now, I'm not talking about little private planes, those little squirrely things. I'm talking about airliners. You know how many people died in America last year in an airliner? 0. According to the logs, there were, 3 billion, close to 3 billion people flew on 37.5 million flights. 35.7 million flights and not one death. Man, I'm telling you what, when you get ready to get on an airplane, you ought to feel safe as in your mother's arms, baby. The chances of you dying in an airplane crash are so much less than walking down the street in America. Get in an automobile? Holy Moses. I mean, you're taking your life in your own hands, and yet we jump in them all day long. And yet we get ready to get in an airplane, and what do? Lord, I hope this thing doesn't go down, right? We put them seatbelts on really tight, like that's going to make any difference whatsoever. What are you doing that for? What if this thing goes down? That's really going to help, I guarantee you. Plowing into the ground, right? But, when we look at it, and yet, if a plane ever does go down, man, we talk about it for 6 weeks, don't we? Man, it's all in the news. But when it comes down to it, it's really not. It's it's the absolute safest way to travel in the world. And yet it doesn't feel that way, does it? As we begin to look at some of the issues that we're going to talk about, we're going to realize that they're that way. As we begin to look at gun violence in America, the first thing that kind of shocked me was that low-income and urban areas are the most prominent places that gun violence happens. You know, we get this feeling from Sandy Hook and other things, you know, that there's just people walking around with guns and, you know, and it's unsafe on the streets and whatnot. This is very interesting. Half of all homicides in the U.S. occur within 63 cities and with 16% of the nation's population. Half of the homicides with guns happen in 63 isolated areas in America with only 16% of the population. And what does that say? It says if we're really concerned about people being killed with guns, it didn't happen in suburbia a whole bunch. And yet when we begin to look at Sandy Hook and all this other stuff, what we start talking about instantly is, you know, we need to ban assault rifles. Well, here's the next thing that's kind of interesting. In 2010, talking about handguns, in 2010, there were 358 murders involving rifles, long guns, something you put up against your shoulder. Murders involving the use of handguns in the U.S. at that same time totaled 6,009. With another 1,939 murders where they didn't report what type of firearm it was. But even if you hold with the same basic thing of, you know, that 358 versus 6,009, rifles are not our problem. I mean, if you just look statistically, small handguns are way more of a problem than assault rifles. And yet, if you look at the political debate right now, everyone's wanting to ban assault rifles and you know, magazines and all this other kind of stuff. And you go, well, if the vast majority of the people are being killed with handguns, I mean, you know, I understand it. Maybe we need to, you know, ban assault rifles. I don't know. But when you look at the statistics, it looks like what we're doing is addressing an emotional issue rather than addressing the real issue. We got a lot of people getting shot. We have a lot of people being murdered, and they're being murdered with guns, but this Sandy Hook thing's got us doing something that looks good and feels emotionally really good, like we ought to do it. But the question is it really doing something that's going to actually help? The other thing that we run into is when we hear these statistics, here's one that kind of threw me off. Gun deaths. People talk about, you know, the high rate of gun deaths. 2009 is where this stat came from. Gun deaths, 59.8% of all firearm injured deaths were suicides. 36.7 were homicides. So when people are talking about gun deaths, many times the statistics they're quoting are talking about people actually taking their own life, not actually people walking around shooting each other. We go, wow. You know, because the question is getting rid of guns really going to stop people who want to commit suicide from committing suicide, or they just use a gun because they're more handy? You know, would they take pills or do something else? And you go, okay. You know, the next thing that we look at is we say, you know, what we really want to do is prevent lives. But when we look at Sandy Hook, if you look percentage-wise at the people who are killed in those type of attacks, like the movie theater or whatnot, the percentage is dangerously small compared to the people who are actually being hurt with firearms. You know, and so the thing is, are we looking at the right thing? Or are we just having an emotional reaction to something that's going on? And are we, you know, because if we're looking at the inner city and over half of the gun violence that's going on in America is happening in the inner city, then the question is, what do we do about the inner city? I mean, how do we take care of that? Because, I mean, guns are huge. They're a big issue. But maybe there's a bigger social issue that's there, and we pacify ourselves by going, you know, we're just going to pass a couple of gun laws, and that's going to fix something. You see, I lived in Los Angeles, which is one of the cities on this list. Last year, gun homicides in the U.S., there were more in California than any other state. 1,200 homicides in the state of California. Next was like Texas with like 444. Most of those happening in California are happening in the gang areas that is going on. And we got a huge issue. Now, as we begin to look, and again, I'm not trying to argue one way or the other, there, but I want to know if I'm going to do something, is it really going to matter or is it not? I mean, what am I really looking at? Because when I lived there, I worked for the city of Pasadena, working with at-risk youth. We put them in jobs so that they could see what life could be outside of their very narrow little world. Very first day, we got to the city hall in Pasadena, and the police rolled out a map of Pasadena with all of the gang grids circled on the map. And as we looked at the map and all these gang grids, we had to make sure every student was placed in a job so they didn't have to cross a gang boundary in the area that they were in. And so we spent all of our first couple of days trying to place all of our students in areas where they didn't cross gang lines. But the problem was, almost all of them had to go to summer school, and summer school was set up at the Pasadena City School, which is where our offices were. Very first day of school, they bus all these kids over for there, and then they're going to drive them back and drop them off, in their neighborhood so they can go to their jobs. Very first day, someone comes in screaming, "There's gang members in the yard." And I go and I pull down the blind and look out, and there are about 20 preteens. 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. And they've got bats and, and tire irons and stuff, but we're talking about some little kids here, right? 11, 12, 13, my apologies to anyone 11, 12, or 13. But we're not talking about 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old people here. The police descend on this place like locusts. They grab all of these kids, put them two in a police car, drive them back, sit them back out on the streets. They close down the school. They close down our offices. They moved our offices back to Pasadena City Hall. We'd only been there one day. And I am going, are we not overreacting just a little bit to a bunch of little kids out here trying to, show off? But I was wrong. I showed up at work the next morning. Those kids had met back at that exact same school, and that little kid that they were coming after was beaten to death with a baseball bat in the parking lot, 12 years old. My fourth day on the job, I went to his funeral. And I said, you know what? I've been raised in the burbs, and I do not have a box to put this in. I don't understand how 12-year-olds could beat each other to death because somebody crossed the wrong street. And my question is this. Are the problems that we have there, are they gun problems? Are they a societal problem that we have? And if you take away guns, they'll just use something else, just the way suicide is an issue. A gun is a handy thing if you want to commit suicide, but there are a whole bunch of other ways to do it, and I don't think a suicidal person is going to go, wow, I don't have a gun. I guess I won't take my life. We have big issues here. Guns are pointing them out, and I think we need to be careful because guns are unbelievably dangerous. But many times we can get revved up about certain things and not deal with the real issues that are kind of down there below it. Now, guns are dangerous because they fire projectiles. Okay? But the most dangerous projectile in America, if you have small kids, you may want to cover their eyes. I'm getting ready to show it to you. On the screen, the most dangerous projectile in America. Oh, look, it's a Barbie beetle. A car. Last year, in America, let me find my statistic here real quick. Last year in America, there were 11,075 firearm-related homicides. 11,078 people were killed with firearms. Last year, cars killed 39,000. Just short of 4 times as many people were killed with automobiles. And guys, we're in an epidemic right now when it comes down to distracted driving. We got a major issue, and we're looking at that one too, but most of us aren't as revved up about getting rid of our cell phones and our texting devices as we are about getting rid of guns either. And yet it has 4 times the potential just about to take a life. Because we have a problem. We have a tendency to get revved up about stuff that doesn't affect us much. I look at Hollywood, and they're easy to pick on because they're out there, but Hollywood usually has a lot of people that want to speak out against gun violence and banning guns and assault weapons and whatnot. And yet, if you try to talk to them at all about censoring the movies that they make that glorify gun violence, they just get all testy. And you go, I think both are a problem. I think if we're going to glorify gun violence in our movies and in video games, and then expect that somehow we're not going to be affected as a society, we're just foolish. But most of us want what we want. We don't necessarily want to step back and look at what's healthy. Now, here's the thing. I believe there need to be controls and regulations on a lot of stuff. My grandfather died of lung cancer at a very young age, in his 50s, 60s, right about where I am. Because he drove a city bus his entire life in Nashville. He never smoked a cigarette in his life, but secondhand smoke gave him lung cancer. And he died because he rode in that bus 8 hours a day with people smoking the entire time, with that cabin being full of secondhand smoke. We eventually looked at the fact that we are free. You're free to smoke any number of cigarettes you want all day long, but you can no longer smoke them in a public building or in an airplane or in a bus with other people who don't, because I can't let my freedom endanger the life of someone else needlessly. And we have all kinds of laws like that. When it comes down to, knowing who is getting guns and are they healthy and sane, man, I'm telling you what, we're ignorant. Are we not ignorant if we don't care who is carrying firearms? We care who buys drugs around here. Man, I'm telling you what, I'm trying to get a prescription down there. I got to give blood just about, to get my prescription out, right? If somebody is unhealthy or dysfunctional and they rob someone, we put them in prison, right? If we got a problem with guns and we are not monitoring who has them, then we're just being stupid, I think. I think we're just being foolish. Now, where those boundaries lie, I think we can get emotional and crazy, and we can do a bunch of stuff that doesn't fix anything, but just makes us feel better. But to go that we aren't supposed to have any control, I think it's crazy. But when we look at these kind of hard issues, a lot of what we're trying to pass legislation on, I am afraid, and I may be wrong, but I am afraid what we're doing makes us emotionally feel good, but doesn't really deal with most of the real issues. And as I begin to look, the question is, what about behavior? Because I really think that's where the issues are going to ultimately come down if we really want to save lives. If that's really is our goal, is we want to save lives, we've got to look at why people are killing people. How can change. I've heard people say, and I force myself to look at both sides of almost everything. And I've always thought, why do I need a gun that can fire that many shots that fast? I don't know that we do. But just the fact that a gun fires fast, because I have people say, this assault weapon, you can shoot the X number of rounds so you can kill this many people. And if you had a handgun, you couldn't fire it that fast. And if you had a knife, you couldn't even hardly get to them that fast. So if we take away all the guns, all the assault weapons in particular, we save mass killings. And I go, with guns? You see, I went over to Israel, where there are mass killings all the time, and almost none of them are done with guns because they are so restrictive you can't even get a gun into the country. I mean, they basically, cavity search you just to go anywhere around Israel, right? Because they're constantly worried about terrorist attacks. You know how they kill lots of people? Bombs. Yeah, because you can go down to the drugstore and get everything you need. If you can't get a gun in, what do? You go and you get a piece of pipe and and you stuff it with the chemicals and whatnot. And you put an igniter in there, and they're blowing up stuff and killing large numbers of people. I mean, if you have someone as crazy as the people that walked into that movie theater, and you took all the assault. This is me thinking, and you take all the assault weapons away, and they really want to create that big of a stir. I go down and create a backpack full of pipe bombs, walk down the hallway and just keep throwing them in rooms as you're running down the hallway. You're going to blow up more people than you could actually physically pull a trigger and shoot. Again, if people want to do that kind of stuff, there are more than one way to do that. And I'm telling you, building a gun in your house is a difficult job. I mean, I can't even imagine trying to machine the parts to build a gun, but you can go out on the internet and run down the hardware store and you can get most of the stuff you need to be able to create a bomb in your own deal. And the thing is, I don't know that there might not need to be some bans on assault weapons. But I don't know that that's going to fix the problem if the problem is something deeper than that. Now, going back to this book, because this is where my Christian background just really jumps up here. My pastor used to say, don't try to fix a problem with a rule. Don't try to fix a problem with a person with a rule. And the Bible talks about sheep and goats. And he said, I've learned that every time I have a goat and they're a problem and I try to create a rule to fix the goat, it almost always ends up killing a sheep. And the goat goes on. Anybody ever in your workplace, they ever had a little problem, they decided to make some kind of global policy for the whole company to fix that little problem, and it ends up being a nightmare to everybody? You don't fix problems with individuals by trying to create a law or a rule or that kind of stuff. It never works. If we got an issue, we need to deal with the issue. That's what we need to deal with. And the issue that we've got in America is the fact that we have a moral erosion that is happening. Because as I look at the inner city, if we were to somehow be able to strike the amendment that gives us the ability to have guns, and we did everything we could to get rid of every gun, I don't think that violence on the inner city is going to change very much. I saw them beat a 12-year-old to death with a baseball bat. They used to use switchblades. I think if someone wants to be a murderer, they're going to be a murderer. It may be more handy, but it's not going to ultimately fix the problem. In that book, Predictably Irrational, they did one last study that was very, very telling, especially for this issue, I think. They let people take a test to find out how honest they would be. And what they did was you would take a test, and they did it with a massive test group, and it was a hard test. The average of every class that took it was around 33% correct. We're talking about a hard test. Now, then they brought in another group, and they took the test, and then they said, after you finish taking the test, we want you to transfer your answers over to this scorecard with bubbles, where you fill in the little bubble thing. You ever done that? When they transferred them over, the scorecard they gave them, the bubble that was correct was gray, and every other bubble was red. So you actually could see the right answers all the way down there. And so they would move their scores across, and then they had to turn in both pieces of paper. They found out that the grade point average went up by 7 points from the average when they were able to see the answers. They didn't cheat a lot, but they all kind of cheated a little bit. The one that you can rationalize. You're like, oh, I knew that. Wait, no, I knew that. I just made the wrong mark there, right? And then they did another time where you transferred your answers across, but instead of turning them both in, they had a shredder where you shredded your original and all you turned in was the card. Guess what? Yeah, we cheated. But not a lot. Nobody was getting 80s and 90s, but they were all getting like 40s and, And they said in every group, they found out that they were all tempted to cheat up until the point that their conscience began to arrest them a little bit. They said, wow. But they had another idea, so they did another test. They did the same thing where you shred your test and you turn in the other. But they said to one of the tests, to half the test people, I want you to write down 10 books that have powerfully influenced your life. We want a list of the books that have influenced you. And so, people would write them down. If they'd never read a book, they just, put none. But they were just write them down. And then they went and took the test. Scores, identical. Same thing. Cheated, not exorbitant, but there. The other test group, they said, before you take the test, we want you to write down as many of the 10 commandments as you can remember. Some of them could only remember 2 or 3. But write down as many of the 10 commandments as you can possibly remember. Then they took them in, they gave them the test, they traded their scores, they shredded their stuff, they turned them in, and in the book it said, we were astonished. Because the percentage was about 33%. Just being asked to write down as many of the 10 commandments almost completely eradicated cheating. They came back and did the test just because they were a little freaked out. They didn't want to give Christianity the big bump that it looked like it was giving it. So they went back and they did it. It was at MIT. And they had them signed before they had the MIT Code of Conduct and Ethics. And they said, we want you to sign this before you take the test. And when they got done, they actually had 33%. None of them cheated either. And they said, when people are reminded about a moral compass, their radical behavior to justify dysfunctional behavior was curbed almost every time. They said the other thing that was kind of crazy is MIT doesn't have a code of ethics. They made it up. But just the fact that there was a moral compass placed there curbed their natural bent to be dishonest, to be unhealthy. And this is my Christian thing coming out. I think we can ban all kind of stuff. Man, you remember when alcohol was such a problem in America? Prohibition worked really great, didn't it? We outlawed alcohol and ended up with organized crime and God only knows what all else. And finally they just gave up and said, listen, you're going to drink, you might as well go on and drink. You know why? Because the law didn't change people's behavior. Guess what did change it? You know the automobile accident statistics that I gave you? You know drunk driving in our generation is drastically lower than it used to be. You know why? Because a couple of moms took pictures of their dead kids who were killed in drunk driving accidents and created a little organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And they just stood and they held up pictures of their kids and they go, in a country like ours, this should not happen. There was a time in America where we winked and we laughed at drunk driving. We don't wink and laugh at drunk driving anymore. But what changed our nation was not prohibition. What changed our nation was some godly women praying and standing up and going, this is the real issue. People are dying. If we don't get a handle on our behavior and we don't have our moral conscience shaken, nothing's going to change. And a godly call to being healthy people changed the conscience of our nation. We stopped winking at it and we started taking it seriously. Today, if you get drunk and drive a car, most everybody in America will look at you like you're a scumbag. Where 30 years ago they would have just gone, hey, he's a great guy. You know? Our consciences were changed because some godly people stood up for the right thing. I don't know what your convictions are going to be. I think we need to have some controls. I don't know what all of them need to be. I hope wiser people have sane heads. But for any place that I speak forth, I want to speak about let's not just do something that's going to make us feel good but doesn't make a difference. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that your Son came in the name of love. And he was willing to be betrayed with a kiss. He was willing to be scorned and rejected by all the religious establishment to show us a way that is different than our human nature. Our human nature says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus showed us a better way. Lord, I want to be a person that speaks life. Lord, when we look and realize that these huge, crazy gun death numbers, homicides, are huddled up in 63 cities, in less than 16% of our population. Lord, that as we begin to pray and as a nation try to figure out what to do, that, Lord, we'll figure out how to deal with that problem. And that, Lord, we won't pass laws that make us feel better, but never address that obviously huge dysfunctional situation in our society. And Father, I know as the compass, the moral compass of our nation slips, as we get farther and farther away from anything that would hold us to a place of accountability, just like those tests, we are going to see more dysfunction. And Father, I ask that for every one of us individually, that you'd give us an understanding of how to just speak life to people. Lord, as we have an opportunity in the 100 days to go into one of the poorest, low-income housing areas down at Napier, and watch over those little kids, and as we get to go up to Gallatin, to the Shalom Zone, that, Lord, as we enter into those pockets, that, Lord, you'll give us the ability to have impact, to touch those young people's lives, to give them the ability to see your love. And that, Father, in whatever other way we would be able to be a small part of the big thing that you are doing, that, Lord, you would give us that opportunity. Because, Lord, we know that laws are not going to correct everything that we've got going on. There's going to have to be an awakening, like those mothers who changed the nation's attitude on drunk driving. Lord, we're going to need people with a moral compass to be able to give us the ability to see homicide rates drop. Lord, give us the understanding of how to make good laws. But, Lord, that we wouldn't just sit around expecting those to do the trick, but that, Lord, we would let our lives count as well. Work in and through us as we try to look at very difficult issues and make healthy choices. In Jesus' name, amen.